In August 1792, after 3 years of revolution, Parisians, tired of the lies of their king Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette, marched on his palace and imprisoned Louis and his family. Louis XVI was put on trial, found guilty of treason and guillotined. Then it was the turn of the unpopular queen Marie Antoinette to face trial. After 2 days of trial, at 3 in the morning of the second day of trial, Marie Antoinette was condemned to be guillotined. As the courtroom audience poured out joyfully into the streets to proclaim this hardly surprising news, the stunned, exhausted, but defiantly dignified Marie Antoinette was led back to her cell. She had not slept, apart from a few snatched hours of fitful rest the previous night. But now, the last night of her life, she had no time to sleep. She requested a pen and paper to write her will. Marie Antoinette began to write to her sister-in-law, whom she had left behind in her first prison, with her beloved daughter, Marie-Therese. The 16th of October, 4:30 in the morning. I am writing to you, dear Elizabeth, for the final time. I have been condemned to death, but it is not a shameful death, because I am not a criminal. Soon I will rejoin your brother. I am innocent like him and hope to show the same firmness as he did in his final moments. I am calm, as one is when one's conscience has nothing to reproach one with. But was Marie Antoinette really innocent? The Queen's indictment at her trial referred to her wanton and excessive spending, her squandering of France's gold, wrung from the sweat of the people. Surely the revolutionaries had exaggerated. How could Marie Antoinette alone have blown every little sou, every little penny that France possessed? Well, there had been exorbitant spending on diamonds, and there had been the huge salaries and gifts for her friends and their useless hangers-on. The beautiful Princess de Lamballe alone had cost the state more than 100,000 écus every year. But worst of all was the gambling. She ran up massive debts because of her gambling, and the people knew about the Queen's debts, possibly because she had never had any money left to give to charities. They began rioting at the impossibly high price of bread, at the exorbitant taxation which bled them dry, as their children starved to death. They told each other that their children starved to death so that Marie Antoinette could spend. The writers of the scandalous newspapers, aware that Louis XVI was a sorry excuse of a lover. They had invented lots of lovers for their luscious queen. After all, if the king wasn't up to it, someone else must be keeping this gorgeous queen happy. But the truth was very different. In the weeks before her husband was deposed, this courageous wife, Marie Antoinette, adamantly refused to abandon her weak husband and fly to the safety of Belgium to be with Fersen, as the desperately anxious Fersen repeatedly begged her to do. But now, in the last hours of her life, Marie Antoinette did not think of her executed husband. Her thoughts turned to the love of her life, the man who stood by her forever, the man she knew would be broken-hearted by her death, Axel von Fersen. She didn't dare mention him by name, but she wrote a message just for him. She wanted him to know of her love. She wrote, "I had friends. The idea of being separated from them forever and the thought of their pain is one of the greatest regrets that I carry away with me in my death. May they learn, at least, that until my last moment, I thought of them." Marie Antoinette hoped that her will would be made public, as her husband's had been, and that Fersen would understand her last message of love to him. But it was not to be. The bloodthirsty revolutionary Robespierre hid the will under his mattress with other trophies he'd squirreled away from people he'd sent to the guillotine. He could take them out and gloat over them whenever he wanted to. It was years before Marie Antoinette's will surfaced, and by that time, Fersen was dead. Why would starving, overtaxed people care that Marie Antoinette, this spendthrift Austrian, was throwing herself into this endless partying in order to block out her unhappiness at the treacherous French court, surrounded by treacherous ministers, in-laws and courtiers? Empress Maria Theresa was furious at the malicious libels about her beautiful young daughter, "My poor, innocent queen," while Marie Antoinette's apathetic husband did nothing to stop the libels. He even found them funny. It was only during the Revolution that Marie Antoinette finally became the mother she should have been. She had suffered a miscarriage or two and had lost two, so the two that were left became everything to her. She wrote, "I am broken-hearted at leaving my poor children, leaving them behind. You know how I lived only for them. These last words of mine may serve as my blessing for my children. I would like them both to think of what I have never ceased to instill into them, having high principles and performing one's duty are the most important thing in life. Their affection for each other will ensure their happiness in the future." Marie Antoinette had learned bitter lessons during the Revolution, but it was too late for herself and far, far too late for her darling children. In her last weeks of imprisonment, Marie Antoinette's children were taken away from her. She would never live to see her darling children grow up. Her sweet and sensitive 8-year-old son, the apple of his adoring mother's eye, was wrenched from his mother's arms just a month before Marie Antoinette was moved to her final prison. For 2 whole days, she heard him sobbing with grief in the room below her own, in the Temple Tower. Until the exasperated guards terrified the poor child into silence. For hours each day, she sat at the gap in a door to try to glimpse her son in the distance as he passed to go into the garden with his guards. Marie Antoinette was horrified when she heard that Simon, a coarse, brutal guard in the Temple Tower, had been entrusted by the cynical revolutionaries with the so-called care of her son. She would have been even more horrified if she had heard the stories of the cruel treatment of her son, which soon filtered out from the temple tower. Eventually, and not surprisingly, Marie Antoinette's son became heartbreakingly ill, alone in his room in his last weeks. As the guards noticed that the child was terribly ill, they became a little kinder. Is it any consolation that the feverish child was reported by a sympathetic guard to have heard his mother's voice in the moments before he died? Is it any consolation that the feverish child was reported to have heard angels singing? Listen, can you hear them? It's so beautiful. Minutes later, the 10-year-old died. Marie Antoinette's children could have been kept in a room together, but they were left alone in their separate rooms to endure their nightmares and terrors alone. Fortunately, Marie Antoinette died not knowing how much her precious children were to suffer. Even before dawn, Paris had been arming, and thousands upon thousands of National Guards and soldiers could be heard converging on the Queen's prison and key points all over Paris. The revolutionaries dreaded a rescue attempt. They knew hundreds of royalists had sworn to rescue the Queen. They flooded every street near the prison and en route to execution with tens of thousands of their men. The streets were already crowded, with everyone jostling for a vantage point. No one could move backwards or forwards. The hags were already in place with their knitting at the foot of the guillotine, waiting for the best show in town, waiting for the head to roll. Perhaps remembering the horrific murder of her dear friend, the Princess de Lamballe, the Queen anxiously asked the kindly turnkey, La Riviere, "Do you think the people will let me reach the scaffold without butchering me first?" La Riviere tried his best to reassure the Queen. Without warning, and while standing behind her back, the executioner roughly grabbed hold of the Queen's once golden locks, now sadly whitened by grief, took out scissors from his pocket and chopped Marie Antoinette's hair into ugly, jagged shards. Finally, Marie Antoinette was led out of her prison, paused in shock where she glimpsed the farm cart, waiting to carry her to her execution, before resolutely moving forwards, exposed to the gaze of thousands of spectators. The streets of Paris were bristling with soldiers. Cannons were stationed at every major road. Drummers were drawn up in front of the cart to play their mournful dirge. Many seemed to be in shock at the gaunt, forlorn and solitary figure of Marie Antoinette, sitting on a bare plank of wood as she jolted past them in the farm cart. Witnesses recalled how Marie Antoinette gazed resolutely ahead, two bright spots of crimson adorning her cheeks, the only visible signs of Marie Antoinette's inner turmoil. What was she thinking of? Was she thinking of her happy childhood? Was she thinking of happy times in the past of her children? Was she thinking of her beloved Fersen? After an hour of this agony, Marie Antoinette's suffering was finally over. She tripped lightly up the steps to the scaffold as she was eager for it all to end. Can anyone blame her?